He's all about the story. He's all about the blood. That's what he brings.
He was Russia's best paid author by this stage. He made an absolute mint from it.
He basically helped to kill off the chronicle as a form. You can actually see sales of chronicles drop off after Shakespeare starts writing these history plays.
Welcome to the Canon Club with Paul Morland and Ed West.
The great irony of his life is that he has astonishing, amazing charm at a distance. His work and his letters exercise a tremendous attraction.
Exploring the Western canon in art, music and literature, one life at a time. This week,
as Stalin established himself, a new philosophy arose. It caused him great distress and even possibly moments of suicide. He wasn't called back. The suggestion is he went back to see what was going on, and whoever had been supposed to be interviewing him had been purged and made to disappear.
Shostakovich.
Dmitri Shostakovich is considered one of the great composers of the 20th century and one of the greatest of all Russian musicians. Noted for versatility of style, his work includes 15 symphonies, string quartets, concertos, but also operas, ballets, and a number of works composed for theatre and cinema. His work also became the soundtrack of the Soviet Union and its turbulent existence, first under Stalin's terror and later Nazi invasion. A schoolboy when the Bolsheviks seized power, he came to survive life in the Soviet Union until the Brezhnev years, despite denunciation, threat of execution, rehabilitation, a second denunciation, and eventual conscription into the party. His popularity in the West, the cause of his second fall from grace, has only continued since his death, and today his popularity has never been greater. Today I welcome as a guest to talk about the composer none other than Paul Morland, my co-host. For today's episode, we are engaging in a bold artistic experiment by getting Paul himself to talk about a subject that is close to his heart. So Paul, welcome to your own podcast. We want to start with the background of the world he grew up in, the soon-to-be doomed world of Tsarist Russia. Can you talk about his upbringing, the musical influences, and the Russian musical scene at the time before the Bolsheviks took over?
The world he grew up in was not just the doomed world of Tsardom, but the particularly doomed world of middle, perhaps upper middle class, bourgeois, intelligentsia. It was the St Petersburg middle class. His father was a chemical engineer. His mother was a piano teacher. It was a relatively wealthy family in this enormous empire, which was an empire of contrasts. It was very backward in many ways. The majority of its people were peasants, lived on the land, and were very poor. But Russia had been developing at an extraordinary pace over the previous decades. It had a rapidly growing population in the cities. And of course, this is all a matter of endless discussion among Marxists. Was it developed? Was it backwards? Was it ready for a revolution? Did it have a proletariat? In cultural terms, Russia was also developing with extraordinary speed. It's something that always strikes me as extraordinary, that Western forms, the novel, the symphony, and modern Western style painting came to Russia rather late. And yet, in the late 19th century, is an extraordinary flowering of the arts in Russia in a way that's quite different from what was going on in Western Europe. If you think about Borodin, Tchaikovsky, Mussorgsky, there's an extraordinary amount of energy and passion. I see this in Russian painting of the late 19th century as well. Russia has come to Western forms, brought its own genius, its own traditions in music, particularly the music of the Russian church. And it's putting these two things together, the Western form and the Russian content. And it's something new and very exciting in a way that the late 19th century Romantic tradition was perhaps getting exhausted. I love Brahms. I love Bruckner, and we talked about Bruckner. We can see the Romanticism in Western music coming to a point of exhaustion. With Mahler, you feel this tradition's coming to an end. In Russia, it's still got a lot of energy. It's got a long way to go, which is why you have, and we'll come on to this, Shostakovich, Prokofiev writing symphonies decades after the German symphonic tradition had effectively died with Mahler before the First World War.
It makes you wonder how many more great musicians might have actually been produced if they weren't killed. He's born in 1906. As a child, the biggest event, Russia goes to war in 1914. And then when he's about 11, there's 2 revolutions in Russia. Can you tell me about his family's politics? I know his first piece of music sort of commemorates heroes of the revolution, but his politics are, if not ambiguous, then he was certainly disguising something. So, if you were a middle-class person in St. Petersburg, how do you react to Lenin turning up?
Well, the intelligentsia were generally against the Tsarist regime. They were the basis of the opposition, whether it was liberal or social democratic. His family were typical in that respect. His parents weren't extremely political. He had aunts and uncles who were involved in popular will. They were kind of lefty liberal types who saw...
Popular will were quite extreme, though, weren't they, on the spectrum of...
Some of his aunts and uncles were more to the left of liberalism. If you were a middle-class St. Petersburger, you were embarrassed and ashamed very often. Of course, there were exceptions. You felt you were a European, effectively. And this is the great debate between Europeans and Slavophiles in Russia. The majority of the middle class spoke foreign languages, very often French, were interested in scientific ideas, felt it was humiliating to live in a country without a constitution, which had been the case until 1905, 1906. The constitution set up after the 1905 revolution, the Dumas, it was dodgy. Franchises could be changed at will. And the Tsarist regime wasn't really responsible to parliament. So any democratic forms were show dressing. All power remained with the Tsar, the supreme autocrat who controlled everything. Now, Nicholas II, a more interesting figure than some would say, quite intelligent in some ways, but I think of him a bit like Bashar al-Assad. In fact, he lasted for almost exactly the same time as Bashar al-Assad. I think it was almost exactly within a year their reigns were of similar length, with a 1905 revolution interrupting the first one of Bashar, just as Nicholas, just as the 2011. I mean, the timing's uncanny. But anyway, they both inherited their empires from utter rigid autocrats, perfectly set up to run that kind of system, Alexander III.
But he was a terrifying figure, wasn't he, really? And he wasn't the most compassionate and loving father.
I think Alexander III was quite a good family man. But the basic point is you have a system which relies on a tough autocrat. And through laws of inheritance in Russia and the de facto laws of inheritance in Syria, what comes to power is someone who's not really equipped to run the system. Of course, Russia is socioeconomically developing extremely rapidly, becoming very complex. And it's harder and harder to run on that sort of system. The middle classes wanted a European-style constitution overwhelmingly and were embarrassed by the rigidity, the autocracy, the backwardness of Russia, and generally had very little time for the church, which since the times of Peter the Great had effectively been an office of state. It was entirely run by the government and had no autonomy. So you could pretty much say all the intellectual middle class, with individual exceptions, were against the regime. But of course, what came in its stead was another question. Once you'd worked through the February and October revolutions, once the Bolsheviks were in power, first of all, you had crushing civil war, but also this was not necessarily the kind of regime that most of these people wanted.
I noticed his paternal grandfather was actually Polish, and he was sent to Siberia, where he stayed after he was allowed to, and that's how they came to settle there.
That's right. There was some Polish origin in the family and some tradition of dissidents.
Right. So his first breakthrough comes at the age of 19, his first symphony. Is that particularly young or amongst more modern composers?
He went to the conservatory at 13 and was the youngest pupil there. So obviously he was very talented, although by all accounts not a child prodigy. By his teens he was showing real promise. 19 is not early for a symphony if you are Schubert or Mozart. So there are child prodigies who are producing extraordinary works. The very early symphonies of Schubert and the very early symphonies of Mozart are not particularly known, but they were writing pretty serious music at 16 or even 14. So 19 is not that early, but as music, it's a complicated issue, but as music became more developed, romanticized, complex, it seems that people's output reduced. So it's unimaginable that someone in the age of Brahms could have produced the 104, 105 symphonies of Haydn. And also, perhaps more challenging to write music when you're very young. So perhaps it was more likely you could write in the Baroque or classical style from a very young age than that you could write the kind of music that was being written in the late 19th century, and particularly the early 20th, with its complexity. This is quite controversial. It's very difficult to pin this down, but it's hard to imagine someone like Mahler writing a symphony.
Right, so music became more complex, and obviously since the Second World War it's become, I suppose, less complex. Could you talk about his early symphonies? Soon enough, politics starts to, and I want to get to the next point, is where politics starts to become a real problem, obviously, if you live in the Soviet Union. But he was well regarded. Everyone thought he's going to go far and big talent.
The first symphony shows great promise, and it is a pretty good work. It's still in the repertoire. I heard Simon Rattle play it at the Barbican a couple of years ago. It's still played. And it's not particularly difficult or inaccessible. But there was growing in the course of the 1920s a movement for proletarian culture. There had been a Soviet revolution. The Bolsheviks had taken power. There had been a civil war. By the time the regime started really to establish itself, it had to start asking what it wanted to do with the arts. In the early days, it had been a bit of a free-for-all. And as time was going on, there came to be an ideology of proletarian culture, which pretty much argued that the arts had been traditionally an expression of bourgeois society. In Marxism, everything like culture is a superstructure above the underlying substructure of economic relations. Just as the economic relations had changed, the bourgeoisie had been expropriated, a new proletarian regime had been established, supposedly, not the dictatorship of the party, but the part of the party were the advanced guard, the avant-garde of the proletariat. So now we have this new political settlement, this new economic settlement. So too, we should have a culture which reflects it. That's the first official line. The output was pretty execrable, I think is probably the best word for it.
Is this the prole cults, the actual...
Prolet, yeah. Shostakovich kind of had to fit into that. I don't know his second and third symphonies, but I think they're pretty much in line with that philosophy. Then we get to the fourth symphony, which is really interesting. It's quite modernist in a way. It's not especially easy to get to know, but it's really interesting. It's got some extraordinary soundscapes. At that point, the political view was starting to change. There was a sense that prolet cult had really not got anywhere, wasn't producing the goods. As Stalin established himself, a new philosophy arose. The prolet cult people who'd been making life difficult for all the talented artists began to be pushed into the background. The new ideology was socialist realism. The idea of socialist realism was, we're building socialism, comrades. Everyone is a worker in this venture, and artists have to be the engineers of the new socialist man. Therefore, we must create a kind of art that is positive, that shows a glowing future. It doesn't wallow in personal sentimentality. It's always positive and forward-looking. That was the direction the ideology of the state and its guidance to culture was taking as we come into the mid-30s and Shostakovich's first brush with the authority.
So this is the period when sort of films about tractor production. The problem was that Stalin did take a great interest in the arts, which kind of made it worse. He had a genuine appreciation of music, and apparently he was not a bad poet, as far as sort of dictators go.
He certainly took an interest in the arts. It's hard to imagine that a regime as totalitarian as that of the Soviet Union would not, one way or another, So if it hadn't been Stalin, it would have been someone else bossing all the artists around.
But there's a famous instance, isn't there, where he invites like 40 novelists and artists to talk about, creating engineering the souls. And I think within a decade, he'd murdered 31 of them.
And generally, the musicians, the composer did better than the others for some reason. Maybe because there's more ambiguity in music.
Well, music's not so explicit, isn't it? It's in that Julian Barnes novel when he says in Pravda the writers get denounced on page 1 and the composers only on page 3. We should come to Shostakovich's problems, which come with the worst sort of musical review in history, when his interpretation of Macbeth was denounced in a Pravda review, which we think maybe was written by Stalin. Was it written by Stalin?
My view is an awful lot about Shostakovich is based on suggestions, memoirs, rumours. Of course, there's the famous book Testimony, which we may come on to talk about. He wrote Lady Macbeth of Macent's region, and it was well reviewed. People liked it. It's not a very accessible work. It's not a very populist work, but it was thought of as pretty solid. I think it was January 34 it had its first outing, and it was out there, and there were lots of productions of it. The most generally accepted story is that Stalin came to hear it. He was obscured behind a curtain and maybe put too much on the side of the brass, so he was a bit overwhelmed by the brass. Having heard the opera myself, I could completely imagine Stalin not liking it, whether he was listening to too much brass or not. In January 35, there was a twist, which was there was an unsigned review in Pravda, famously muddle instead of music. And for whatever reason, again, some people will say the grammatical errors or the style made it clear it was Stalin. It probably was, and it no doubt had his sign off. Suddenly, everything changed. The work was no longer played. The reputation of Shostakovich was in shreds, and his work generally wasn't played. Obviously, that's very depressing for an artist. It's very worrying when you're in a totalitarian regime. Shostakovich, at that point, had a young family. At various points in his life, when he was out of favour with the regime, it wasn't just the terror. Later on, it wasn't terror even, but it was the economics of making a livelihood. And if the regime said your work wouldn't be published or played, it was very hard to make a living.
Yeah, his income fell by about 9/10 from what I read. So this is the period, so it's characterized by a kind of understandable cowardice, where lots of people who might be your friends would still have to denounce you. And likewise, you might have to do it yourself later. So he's out of favor. Is he in fear of his life? Could he have been killed? I mean, lots of people were.
I mean, it is interesting that the composers did do better than other artists. The other leading composer, Prokofiev, who was something like 15 years older than Shostakovich and had been in exile and come back, was equally in peril of his life. And they were kept, intentionally or not, on the edge of life and death. There is a story, and again, it's not completely agreed whether this is the case. He was called in for an interview and then told to go home and he'd be called back. He wasn't called back. The suggestion is he went back to see what was going on, and whoever had been supposed to be interviewing him had been purged and made to disappear, and he was told to go home.
That's lucky.
Whether that actually genuinely happened or not, someone will say, I mean, that may be in Testimony or in some other memoir. A very interesting source I was reading recently, the memoirs of Rostropovich's wife, Galina, the great singer. Rostropovich was a great cellist, and she got to know Shostakovich extremely well after the war, and they were very close friends. He dedicated various works to her and her husband. There's quite a lot of anecdote in her book and in the memoirs of other people and in Testimony. Some of these things scholars have gone through and said that doesn't make sense. It couldn't have been that date because. There's a lot of debate about the detail. What's not in doubt, though, is that after the muddle instead of music review, Shostakovich was seen as an enemy of the people by the regime, and any day he could have been carted off, disappeared in the Lubyanka cellars and then off to Siberia or shot. And as you say, so many people were having that experience. At that stage, although his music had been played outside the Soviet Union, he wasn't that well known internationally. So he might have been disappeared without too much of an international event or it really being noticed that much.
Was there a particular style which might put you out of favour, might make you be seen as dangerous right deviationist or reactionary?
At this stage, as I said, prolet cult had gone, socialist realism was in. So it was supposed to be music, the good music, the music you were supposed to aspire to and to write was supposed to be inspiring, forward-looking, optimistic. And this term formalism came in the 30s, and it was used again by Zhdanov in the 40s. Formalism was whatever the regime didn't like in terms of music. You can put that down to two things. Anything too romantic, too sentimental, too personal, maybe depressing, something that wasn't going to be collective, rousing, that's probably a good word, rousing, inspiring the masses as they fulfilled yet more 5-year plans.
Yeah,
so that's exactly what prolet cult didn't like. But as you moved into the 30s, there was more of an attack on formalism. And nobody really knew what formalism meant, which was just as well because the authorities could keep people on tenterhooks. But I think essentially, broadly, what formalist means, focusing too much on the form and not enough on the content. So in music, you have musical forms, the symphony, the string quartet, and within those maybe sonata form or rondo. There are all sorts of musical forms. I don't really know what formalism would mean in that context. What it actually meant, in effect, was generally music that was too obscure, modernistic. I imagine the Soviet authorities didn't want to use the term modern or modernistic because they thought they were the cutting edge of we are the future, we're building the future. So anything that's modern is good. But it has to be popular, it has to be received by the people, has to be understood by the people, has to inspire the people to ever more giddy heights of achievement. And if you listen to Shostakovich's Fourth Symphony, for example, that doesn't really fit the bill. Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, the music doesn't fit the bill, never mind the story. So I think it was anything other than socialist realism. And in Shostakovich's case, experimental.
So about his style of music, it's obviously very versatile. There's some symphony, classical music, and then there's jazz style music and lots of soundtracky stuff, lots of anxious sounds of which you picture the Soviet Union's history. How would you describe it?
Let me refer back to Bruckner, who we've spoken about before on this podcast. People accuse Bruckner of writing the same symphony 9 times, which I think is complete nonsense. That Bruckner built 9 magnificent Gothic cathedrals. Reims is not like Winchester, and Winchester is not like Ely. They are all great cathedrals, and his 3 great masses are a sort of equivalent. He wrote one chamber music piece that I know of. That really sounds like he's trying to build a cathedral in someone's back garden. Lots of other composers have written many different forms. Mozart wrote string quartets, symphonies, concerti, and operas. It's always an exception when a composer hasn't written, like we think, oh, Beethoven only wrote 1 opera, or Chopin only wrote for the piano. So Shostakovich certainly wrote very, very diverse forms. He wrote, as you said, symphonies and string quartets, different sorts of chamber music, operas, more popular music. And it's not just that he wrote in these he wrote music for solo piano, he wrote preludes and fugues in homage to Bach and Chopin. It's not just that his forms were diverse, but the style is so diverse. So there are different Shostakoviches, sometimes in the same work. You have the utter bleakness and tragedy of pieces like the 8th String Quartet, or the absolute terror of Stalin depicted in the 10th Symphony. But you also have very playful music, sometimes in the same works as the bleak music. You have music with very energetic dance themes, often based on Jewish music. And you have the film music. Shostakovich had to write popular music to earn money. He made more money, I think, probably from his film music than from his orchestral music. There's no reason to think he didn't take it seriously. Some of it's very good. And he was anything but a cultural snob. He loved football and he wrote jazz music. He was very eclectic in many ways. You have to distinguish the popular and the serious in a way that recognizes Shostakovich's genius across that spectrum. At the same time, there is music that he was just writing to keep the authorities happy. And where was that popular and where was it keeping the authorities happy? Not always clear. He wrote pieces like the Violin Concerto, which is really searing, and he knew it just wouldn't work. It wouldn't see the light of day in the 40s, and I don't think it came out of the drawer for 20 years. So there's what he had to do for a living to earn money, which wasn't necessarily against his artistic principles. There was what he had to do to keep the authorities happy. There was bearing his soul, which he sometimes did in private and then published the work in the 50s or 60s. Maybe that's why he wrote in so many diverse forms. If you compare him to Haydn, Haydn had to keep the Esterházys happy most of his life. The Esterházys didn't go through different phases. Now it's socialist realism. Now it's prolet cult. Now there's Thor on, Thor off. Now we want something to keep the people on the Esterházy estate dancing around after the harvest. The twists and turns of Soviet history forced Shostakovich to adopt very different styles and tones. But that's not just why he did it. I can't think of another composer who was quite so versatile and could turn his style to so many different things, particularly the emotional side of things. He can be very funny, and he's got this kind of sharp, raw sense of humor and jokey, and he can be utterly bleak. And I think people may think of other examples, but sometimes he's compared to Mahler. In Mahler's symphonies, you get these kind of peasanty dance, the hurdy-gurdy. In the first symphony, there's what people would think of now perhaps as something a bit klezmery, or that what was really just East European folk music. That's a bit light, and then in comes some sort of tragedy. But it's never really funny. It's never spiky, I don't think. I mean, Mahler's a genius. I'm not putting Mahler down, and probably a greater composer than Shostakovich. But I don't think even he had that versatility.
Think of one example you might not approve of, which is Paul McCartney, who has a huge range of different styles, but a different era. There is at least, I suppose, if you're saying, Stalin did at least keep people on his toes, didn't he? So maybe that was one good outcome and encouraged the versatility, because you never know which way you turn. Can we talk about, so he returns the favour. Nice.
On their toes or in their graves.
Yeah. He returns the favour. There's this phone call with Stalin. Did this happen in 1936?
I think the phone call definitely did happen.
Tell me what actually happened to the phone call. Stalin.
I think it was a bit later, wasn't it? 38.
Was it 38?
I think 36 it was sometime in the mid-30s. So we'd had the success of Lady Macbeth. The Fourth Symphony had been allowed. Then we had Muddle Not Music, and he was out of favour. And then sometime in the mid to late 30s, for whatever reason, who knows, there was a change of view. Perhaps it was nothing more or less than Stalin, who was, as we've agreed, quite intelligent and cultured in his way, as well as being a complete monster. They'd say they realised that this was a great composer, and that you didn't just want to put all your best people through the mincing machine. For whatever reason, Stalin decided to lift the effective ban on Shostakovich, and apparently called him and more or less said, it was an administrative error. I don't know, it was there's some administrative error. Of course you're not banned. Of course you're not out of...
And this is the famous Fifth Symphony, described as a Soviet artist's creative response to criticism, which I suppose is the regime's way of allowing someone back in with a degree of supplication.
Well, because Shostakovich was this... I think if we met him, we'd really like him. He was nervous, insecure. He was a very good friend. He wasn't always extremely courageous. He probably wouldn't have survived. But he did what he could. And that title, is what the symphony ended up having. And of course, there's this great debate about the Fifth Symphony. So the slow movement, apparently, when it was played, everyone there had lost friends. Everyone there was waiting for a knock on the door in the middle of the night. And apparently people were just crying in the audience. I would encourage anyone, if you want to listen to one piece of Shostakovich, listen to the slow movement from the Fifth. It's very, very moving. It's extraordinary. It gets back to something we discussed before, my kind of synesthesia. I'm not sure I could begin to imagine life in the Soviet Union without an acquaintance with Shostakovich's music. Then there's the final movement. Here we have this real socialist, realist kind of triumphal noise. The question is, what was that really about? A view of a glorious, radiant future? Or was it sticking two fingers up? That's what it says in testimony. Everything about Shostakovich's attitude to the authorities, someone will argue with. For me, listening to his music, maybe I'm bringing a political bias, but listening to his music, and from what I can make of what his son said, what his friends said, he genuinely, and just what would anyone feel about a regime that was behaving the way it did? He was constantly pushing the envelope and trying to protest.
And then the Russians have endured the 1930s and life under Stalin, and then the Nazis invade in 1941. This is the period of the siege of Leningrad, St Petersburg, where he grew up. And this is his Seventh Symphony, which is very associated with the war, the Eastern Front in particular, and the incredible suffering of all, everyone on the Eastern Front, but I think 1 million and 1.5 million people starved to death in Leningrad.
He wrote that, and it was picked up immediately among the Allies. It was played a lot in America, and there was this heroic, it was very much part of the PR, the heroic Russians. And famously, the opening movement is supposed to depict the Germans rolling into Russia, this relentless march, which is interesting. There's actually a piece of Bartok which makes fun of it. I suppose he was pissed off because he was in America, suffering, dying of cancer. People were not paying him the attention they were paying Shostakovich. He got flown out of Leningrad. The piece was fully orchestrated. It was played, and it kind of became the anthem of the Soviet war. And yeah, it was very popular, and it was very much used, particularly in America, as part of the depiction of this heroic regime and people.
After war, he's sent to New York as this world's Congress of Science and World Peace.
So he was really recognized in the West, and there was a general tendency in the war for the Soviet Union to put communism on the back burner. There was an appeal to patriotism, Christianity, Russian nationalism, old heroes, old icons, and so on. Included in this was the Soviet Jewish culture, the Yiddish culture, which was used to reach out to American Jews who were numerous and influential. And then once the war ended and this was not needed anymore, anyone who'd had serious links with the West was in question. All that Yiddish culture was shut down. Most of the people were murdered. Shostakovich was in that kind of category. He'd been useful in the days of the country coming together and putting up a good show to the world. Then after the war, we have what's known as the period of Zhdanov. Zhdanov was responsible for the arts and culture, and some people think might have been Stalin's successor had he not died before Stalin. And it was the Cold War broke out, whoever was responsible for that. There was a sense that the West was the enemy. There was a new expanded socialist camp. People with links with the West were suspect, and we were going to reintroduce terror, effectively. You might think that we've all pulled together and won this, and therefore we're moving on. But no, we're going back to proletarian dictatorship, authoritarianism.
Was Shostakovich very interested in music? Because that also got him into trouble, didn't it? Was very interested in using Jewish music in his compositions.
I think he was very much affected by the Holocaust. A lot of his friends were Jews, a lot of the musicians and intellectuals in the Soviet Union. He found Jewish music interesting, or at least East European Ashkenazi Jewish music interesting, he thought the dance tunes were a mixture of agony and joy, or trying to be joyous through the agony. I think that kind of appealed to him emotionally. He wrote various things, like his violin concerto's got some very Jewish themes in it, and he kept that quiet. The famous encounter with this issue was when he set the words of Yevtushenko's poem Babi Yar for his 13th Symphony. That was in the Khrushchev period, so we're moving forward a bit now. That poem was very controversial, and the authorities were on with it, off with it, trying to ensure the words were more about Soviet people. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Khrushchevian Russia, as there had been in the late Stalin years as well. That got him in trouble too, although not to the point of worrying about being killed, but that was by the 60s.
He's denounced again. This is the last stuff. And then 1953, to everyone's great relief, Stalin dies. Prokofiev dies on the same day, doesn't he?
Correct. Yeah.
Never get
One of the things that made it a bit easier for Shostakovich by then is he was well known in the West. That was, in some ways, a handicap because he had links with people in the West. Anyone who had links with people in the West was suspect. Soldiers who'd seen the standard of living in parts of Europe were suspect. But on the other hand, he was so famous that if anything happened to him, it wouldn't have looked good in the West. He was persecuted by Zhdanov. He was back in a situation of being banned. Things got pretty crazy in the last Stalin years, and you never knew what was going to happen next. But after Stalin's death, I don't think he was ever in fear of his life again. But he was subject to the changes of direction, the thaws, which were variously reversed. The famous 1956 secret speech denouncing Stalin. He wrote his own 10th Symphony, which I don't think openly acknowledged it was a depiction of Stalin, but I would challenge anyone to understand what it was like living in Stalin's Russia who doesn't know the 10th Symphony. But anyway, as you said, in 1949 he went out to America. He was used as a face of the regime, and that meant it was harder to get at him.
And by this point, his music was being played in the West, was it? Would he be selling records?
Well, this was the start of the mass. I mean, there were records even in the 1890s. There's a famous recording of Brahms, possibly talking and playing the piano. But really, the wealthy had music reproduction in the 20s and 30s. But it was after the war that there was a kind of mass popularity of classical music, of recording, of LPs, and affordable record players. And yes, the name Shostakovich was known, and his pieces were making it into the concert halls and onto records and being bought and appreciated. Obviously, not everyone's taste, any more than Paul McCartney is.
Could you talk about the film score thing? This might be a complete red herring, but he was interested in films, but obviously films were very important to the regime. I love watching those Soviet depictions of Stalin's heroic victory in the war. Was he compelled to do this? Because I suppose a lot of composers might consider film score beneath them. Is that correct?
First of all, when he was young, Shostakovich played in cinemas. In the era of silent movies, there would be a pianist at the front. And he did that to earn a living. It makes me think of Brahms actually playing in the brothels of Hamburg to make a living. I don't think there was an ounce of snobbery about Shostakovich. I think he genuinely loved film. He was interested in it. Some of his film scores are very good. You know, some are hackneyed. Who am I to judge the value of all of them? I think there are more than 30. So there are bound to be some that aren't that good. But it's some very fine work. And I don't think he had any problem doing it to earn a living. And I don't think he had a very sharp view of this is my serious work and this is my popular work.
Under the new regime, Khrushchev, he becomes pressed into joining the party and representing the regime, even in signing letters, denouncing writers. He becomes very much compromised by it. This becomes a source of sadness because most people now believe he wasn't in favour of the regime, but felt scared.
He was under enormous pressure to join the party. He was under enormous pressure to get involved in the administration of the Composers' Union. And it caused him great distress and even possibly moments of suicide.
He was regularly threatening suicide, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, around the period of the 8th string quartet particularly, Around the time he joined the party, it put him under huge pressure. He had to go abroad and make speeches, and he would read these speeches. As far as we know, he didn't believe any of it. He delivered the speeches very ineffectively, and whether that was because he was nervous or he didn't believe what he was saying, it's difficult to know. When he went to Oxford, he got an honorary doctorate, and he stayed with Isaiah Berlin, who described him as small, shy, like a chemist from Canada, nervous with a twitch, playing in his face almost perpetually. Whenever the slightest reference was made to contemporary events or contemporary personalities, the old painful spasm would pass over his face, and his face would assume a haunted, even persecuted expression, and would fall into a kind of terrified silence. He did have to give these speeches. He did have to go to the West. He was the face of the regime. But by all accounts, he didn't do this naturally, and probably was very unhappy about it.
Yeah, it's very sad. And I imagine most of us would probably go along with it if that was the alternative. He died in 1975. He'd had 2 heart attacks. I think he had cancer. He'd been in ill health a long time. How was he received afterwards in the Soviet Union, and how was he thought of today?
Well, by the time he died, he was seen as the great Soviet composer. I think he was buried in Novodevichy, which is like the big place to be buried. I'm sure he was given a big funeral with, Brezhnev looking grim. And then in 1979, his son, Maxim, he had a boy and a girl.
Right. He was married 3 times, right?
Yeah, he remarried his first wife and had 2 kids. She died. Number 2 wife was a disaster, very short-lived. And then a fairly long, happy 3rd marriage. Maxim, by the way, was a talented conductor and pianist. And the 2nd piano concerto, which I know you have got to know a bit, Ed.
Very, I have to say, very beautiful.
It is very beautiful. Although some people say it's a bit of hack work, I think it's.
I love sentimentality in music.
Yeah, and it showed he could do sentimental as well as everything else. But then Solomon Volkov, wrote this book, Testimony, claimed to be more or less a verbatim conversation with Shostakovich, and depicts him very much as a anti-regime. And then, of course, the Soviets reacted and got all the people to say, no, that wasn't what Shostakovich was like. It became a subject of the Cold War in a way. His son defected and kind of said Testimony was inaccurate. But then, at the same time, or maybe later, his son said, yes, but that is what he thought. So I think the general consensus now is that Testimony is not a verbatim account, but it is an accurate reflection of Shostakovich, the dissident who hated the system. Shostakovich, many of whose friends defected, like Rostropovich and his wife, became a bit of a Cold War battleground. Now, he's globally seen as one of the very greatest composers of the 20th century, both innately and inherently because he was a wonderful, versatile composer who wrote in different forms and different moods, and also because almost more than any composer I can think of, he summed up his era. And he summed up his era because, unpolitical or apolitical as he was forced, more than composers of previous eras, to engage with politics. Shostakovich may not have been interested in politics, but politics was interested in Shostakovich and didn't leave him alone. And so inevitably that got reflected in his music.
Thank you. That's a great way to end, I think. I would encourage everyone to listen to Shostakovich on Spotify. I have to admit, I was quite ignorant of his work, except maybe the 7th, but a wonderful composer. Really beautiful. And also a fascinating story to read about and to learn more. I can't say I would like to have swapped places with him and lived in that time, but as you say, there are very few composers or artists who really summarize the periods they lived in. In his case, a very period full of turmoil. And it's really interesting to see how art and culture and history interact in that case. Thanks for coming on the show, Paul. It's been great. Look forward to seeing you once again in your more usual position as a host rather than a guest.
Thank you.